Tonight on The Big Debate, we'll be discussing the highly contentious issue of behaviour in our schools. Is there a crisis, or is it media hype, or somewhere in between? Bad behaviour among children and young people has always been part of our social fabric. So are the problems we're witnessing in schools today any different or more widespread than they used to be? In anticipation of a government review into classroom discipline to be published next week, we'll be examining the key issues regarding pupil behaviour. Why are they misbehaving, and how should teachers, parents and pupils themselves be dealing with the problem? With me to discuss all these issues are Chris Gittins, who's lead advisor to the Department for Education and Skills on Behaviour and Attendance; Gary Phillips, head teacher of the Lillian Bayliss School in South London; Fiona Miller, who chairs the National Family and Parenting Institute; and Roger Grace, the film producer and criminologist. Our studio audience is made up of teachers, parents, experts, and, of course, pupils who'll be putting their points to the panel. So, is there a behaviour crisis in our schools? Teachers TV has surveyed 500 teachers working in both primary and secondary schools across the UK, including head teachers, deputy heads, heads of year, and classroom teachers. When asked, do you think there's a discipline crisis in our schools, 60% said they did believe there was such a crisis. This is particularly pronounced among frontline teachers, those who spend all their time in the classroom, 66% of whom believe it to be true. The figure drops to 38% among head teachers. The highest figure of 67% is among teachers who've been in the classroom for more than 10 years, which suggests the longer you've taught, the worse you think it is. Let's get a sense now of what people think about the scale of the crisis. Chris Gittins, to start with, as a man handling this, advising the government, how do you read it?
Well, there's always been a problem with behaviour. I've been teaching for a very long time, and behaviour's always been an issue. I think the first thing we have to remember is that when you actually look at children's behaviour, the vast majority of children are very well behaved for the vast majority of the time. And we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. As your survey shows, it's also the case, however, that teachers and non-teaching staff find that behaviour support and behaviour and discipline is the #1 issue on which they want help and advice and assistance on. And the same applies to the children. The children identify the behaviour, often actually the behaviour of others, not of themselves, but identify behaviour as being the key issue.
Roger Grace.
I'd rather agree with, I'm afraid to say, almost everything that Chris had said, except for one thing. I think the change in the rights culture, that the troublemakers know their rights and threaten teachers. I think teachers are losing confidence about trying to keep discipline, and because of that, it allows those small number of troublemakers to, I think, take advantage
Which has a very damaging effect on everyone else.
I think it does.
Fiona Miller, as a representing, as it were, as a parent and representing that perspective?
Well, as a parent, I don't think there's a crisis. I think there are some very difficult children, and there probably always have been. I think the media has got a role to play in it. I think it's a better story if there's a crisis in our schools, and it was very interesting the way the Chief Inspector's report was covered recently, a figure which said, that 1 in 10 secondary schools had a behaviour problem, was translated into 1 in 10 of all schools, which was actually 3,000 schools rather than 300, and that became a crisis. Well, I don't think that is right, but I think we have to acknowledge that there are some very challenging young people who need a lot of help and support.
Let me go to at least a representative of schools, Rona Tutt from the National Association for Head Teachers. How do you judge it?
I don't think there's a crisis. I do think there is a lot of concern about behaviour. I think it has got harder to deal with some children in schools than it used to be, and this goes back to the problem that there is a lack of respect now for people in the professions, and at the same time as that has happened, and that's been a change in society, we have had fewer ways of actually dealing with problems as they arise. Teachers are very wary now about intervening in fights, putting a hand on a child, anything that might have helped to restrain them because of being challenged over, it is my right, and you cannot touch me.
Sheila Gunn, you are a Conservative councillor in Camden and you speak on education. How do you see it?
It definitely has got worse. Whether you call it a crisis of course means turning point. I don't think I'd call it a crisis because I get the feeling nothing much is going to be done in the future. It is very much, I think, a case that children are pushing at the boundaries, and if teachers don't feel they can say no and be obeyed, then of course those children, very few children on the whole, they're behaving badly, get away with it.
Gary Phillips, head teacher.
I think I tend to agree with little elements what everybody said. But there is the bigger picture, and what we have now in 2005 is a far more self-actualising society. What we have is a postmodern world in which the traditional compact between things such as the community, the local community, the church, the school, the family, which would patrol those boundaries that you were talking about, no longer exists in such a stable way that it did do. And we no longer have such meshed together communities. We now have very much mosaic communities in which you have rich living by poor, but actually very little mix between the two through their schools.
Quick, because you had this film team that went into 14 schools.
Yeah, exactly.
As you observe it, I know first-hand and second-hand, as it were,
yes.
How do you define bad behaviour in this context?
I was just going to say, because they have large classes, it seems to me you've got about, say, 10, maybe even 15 concentrating kids. You've got another 10 who will go either way. And then you've got, say, 5 or 10, especially, let's say, just 5, who have the capacity to distract the 10 that could go either way. And so the bad behaviour reaches a critical mass when the majority of the class shifts their attention to the misbehaviour instead of to the teacher and go with the concentration.
Does that square with you, Chris?
Absolutely right. I mean, the dynamics of the classroom are terribly important when you come to look at the way in which behaviours manifest themselves. But in answer to the question about what's the common ground in behaviours, the common ground for me is that it's that which interrupts and interferes with learning.
Exactly.
Because that's what schools are about. And our concern about behaviour is not just that it's not good for the individual or not good for the mass, but it actually gets in the way of learning.
Phil Willis, you were a teacher, head teacher for a long time before you went into politics and became education spokesman for the Liberal Democrats. Do you feel, we touched before on whether it's worse or getting worse or not, how do you regard this?
Well, I find this discussion interesting because it's exactly the discussion we would have had 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Because I think every generation says that this group of youngsters are worse than any group of youngsters before. And we had it right. And of course, that's absolute nonsense. I can remember going into my first application for a headship back in 1983 and going around the school to see a child being hung. And I don't see that in classrooms today. The reality is that society has changed. We're working in a very different society where children do not know what the bounds are. And the one, I think there are 3 C's here. First of all is consistency. If you don't have consistency, both within the school and within the classroom, children don't know where they are. And that is crucial. And I think that's missing in society, not just in schools.
Agreed.
Roger Gray, if people like you who make films which have a sensational impact, even if not a sensational purpose, are open to the charge that you are part of the hype of this problem, but you actually think it is getting worse?
I think it's getting worse for the reason that you're saying. If the children don't find limits when they're being raised in the early days. I made a film about 3 to 5-year-olds kicked out of infant school. 3 to 5-year-olds. And the thing that made it work for them was when they were given limits and rewarded for behaving well. And with attention as well. That kind of thing is missing when people are just put in front of a telly and have no limits when they come out and give adults lip.
Arthur Jarman from the NUT, is it constructive to have exposed some of the reality as Roger Grave's most recent films have done?
I'm not sure whether that kind of exposure with cameras hidden in handbags is constructive. But on the issue of...
why not?
Because it doesn't help. It contributes nothing to the teacher's control
his position, presumably.
or the image of the teacher, or the image of the school. It's an entertaining program, maybe, but I don't think it contributes to the argument.
It's quite interesting in this context. Roger Grave.
Well, we had 1,000 teachers who signed up on the website saying, thank God somebody's talked about the problem we face alone. The one problem about teachers, and even heads don't know it, is the loneliness of having to cope with this 5, 6, 7 times a day. And I think that is what we were trying to do, is to have the debate so the teachers can come out and say, yes, it's happening to me.
Let me ask some teachers what they think about this. Do you feel, 2 things about the media. Do you feel undermined by the alleged intrusion? Do you think, however, at the same time, that they're getting it right? I mean, Roger's film and films like it, for example. Any teachers who've got thoughts about that? There, yes, woman at the back on the right there.
I think it's good for people who are not teachers to be able to see what it is actually like in the classroom, or it can be like in the classroom.
You are a teacher?
Yeah.
And do those films demonstrate, give you a feeling of what it is actually like to be a teacher when you look? You don't say that's distorting?
No.
And then your neighbour, you were nodding as well. You're a teacher as well?
Yes, and I was head of year as well, so I had to deal with a lot of behaviour issues, and my whole day used to be taken up with
When you say a lot of issues, people who aren't kind of in there beside you or aren't inside his handbag, or his teacher's handbag, won't be entirely clear what those issues are.
Swearing at teachers, at students. I think that's a big issue, the language that students use. Respect is a big problem. Very often you get the comeback, no, he's not allowed to do that, about a teacher. You use the example, you're not allowed to touch me, you're not allowed to remove me from the classroom, I can do what I want. And I think it comes down to the parents as well, because a lot of them will go home, the students, and you haven't got that parent support then. They will defend, a lot of parents will defend their children to the death. They won't believe that their children have misbehaved or that they've sworn. They will defend them.
Can I just pick up with you, Gary? Leaving aside whether or not it is precisely accurately described, everyone recognises that there is a serious issue here. The kind of behaviour that we heard the teacher up there describing, Ms. Harris, what effect does that have on the capacity of schools to deliver what they're there to deliver?
Poor behaviour stops the learning of everybody in the class. We're all aware of that. The issue is what you do as a school to address that, and it's getting at it systematically and slowly. You can't start with a zero tolerance on bad language if you haven't sorted out the higher level incidents such as violence and abuse towards staff. And what schools have to do is slowly and systematically lower the bar and brings children into the boundaries that we set as adults for children.
Tony Halpin, you write in Education for the Times. You've heard the discussion so far. Do you believe that the media, which you are a member, is hyping it at all, or do you think in general you are getting it right and that the situation is getting worse?
No, I don't think it's being hyped. Obviously there's a danger of that, but it is a genuine public concern, I think, that behaviour in schools is deteriorating. All the main political parties picked up on it in the election, presumably because they thought they were tapping into a genuine concern among parents. I'm not sure quite what the phrase means, but it resonates with people, zero tolerance, as somehow an aspiration that there should be good behaviour everywhere. Presumably because people feel that their own experience of schools is perhaps not in their child's class, but more generally in the school. There is a deterioration of behaviour, and it is affecting the way their child might learn.
I want to look next at the question of what makes children behave like this, insofar as we can answer it. And let's go back to the polls. It throws up some pretty interesting results. The teachers were asked about how certain factors contributed to discipline problems in school. 82% thought that the biggest factor was parental lack of support, and that rose to 88% amongst primary teachers and 89% among heads of year. Over a third, that's 37%, said that a lack of consistent school policy on behaviour contributed to discipline problems, and some 25% blamed an inadequate and unimaginative curriculum. Perhaps unsurprisingly, only 17% thought that poor teaching techniques had anything to do with it. So let's start with parents. Alan Gotch from the Association of Teachers and Lecturers. Do parents not have to shoulder? They do have to shoulder, I presume, from your perspective, quite a lot of the blame. Alan Gotch.
Certainly, parents do have a part to play. As a former teacher, not all that long, and as a former head of year, I understand very well the problems that schools have in getting parents to take discipline problems seriously and to believe that their children are not behaving as they should and are not showing the right kind of respect towards teachers and staff.
This word respect comes up all the time. Fiona Miller, not enough respect from parents towards schools and teachers.
Not much respect for parents, I'd say, listening to this. I mean, it's very easy to blame parents for everything, isn't it? And I think you've got to be careful of that, because there are some parents who are not very effective at what they do in raising their children. But I mean, if I'd been a parent in that class in Roger's film, I'd have wanted to know why such a poor teacher had been left in charge of my kids. And I think a lot of parents might argue back, well, OK, we'll take responsibility for our kids, but do we then have the right not to be taught by 3 supply teachers in a week?
But do you, just before we get on to that, do you not accept part of the drive of that there are parents who, for one reason or another, absolve themselves from responsibility.
Absolutely. As a chair of governors, I've sat on exclusion panels, I've met them many, many times. It's never their child's fault, and that is a very big issue.
But that figure we had there, 17% only, thinking it was to do with
well,
teachers.
I think teaching is an issue, and if you talk to kids about it, they'll tell you, we go to that lesson because it's really interesting, and the teacher's going to make it interesting, and then we go to the next lesson, we muck about because they can't control the class. I'm afraid that's the reality, or we bunk off, I mean,
there's a lot of nodding heads at that.
It's about teaching, it's about the curriculum, and it's about parents. I know you want to talk about solutions later, but I don't think singling out individual groups is particularly helpful, is it?
Let me bring in someone who is a parent, and I think I'm right, Dion Peters, you have 4 children, is that correct? As a parent, what's it like?
It is difficult, but I do believe the main responsibility lies with the parents. It starts from pre-nursery age. You set your boundaries for your children so they know their limits. My children, I try to encourage them to be confident and express themselves, but they must know their limits. It's imperative.
And do you think that too many parents don't acknowledge that, don't recognise that, don't understand that, or what?
I feel that a lot of parents are working, trying to create a better future for their children, and so they don't have as much time to spend with their children as is necessary. What I try to do is speak to my children's teachers to find out how my children are doing, even if it's just a quick word after school, if there are any problems, and how I can work in hand with the school to resolve any issues before they become major.
OK, have we got any... I know, we can see we've got lots of pupils here who must have thoughts about this. Who wants to come in from the perspective, they're all talking about you. Do you want to talk about them? Yes, right in the middle here.
Basically, I feel whenever I watch TV, they not normally, but they focus on children, and normally it's in a bad way. Now, why are media doing this? I mean, coming from my class, there's always a rotten egg. There always have been and will be. But why is the media always showing the bad kids? It's never the good kids.
Anyone else from the pupils' side of the fence?
All right, a lot of the focus goes to the bad children, so the good children get kind of left behind because the teacher has to focus on the bad ones. And I mean, it is like, in my school, there's one teacher to 30 children, so you can imagine the teacher doesn't have enough time to give the focus to each child, which is needed. So when the teacher's focusing on one child, the next child goes off, does something else, and that's how I see, the class starts to get disrupted.
When you look at your friends at school or other children at school who aren't behaving well, do you say to yourself, well, their parents, you heard Mother there talking, that their parents aren't being strong enough with them, or do you say the teacher's not in control enough?
Well, I mean, obviously everyone comes from different backgrounds, so there are obviously parents that don't really pay attention to their children, but my mum is really supportive, and I think there's obviously other children in my school with supportive parents, but their lessons, it's like you go into your class, you sit down, you focus on the board, that you don't really get to go out and see things, like we don't go museums and such things like that. I think is quite depressing. We go into the classroom every single day, day after day, and you don't actually get to go out and see different things.
We'll come on to a little bit of that. Just on that point, Fiona, the government is directing significant fire, in inverted commas, at parents and demanding, requiring that parents do more than they're allegedly doing at the moment, ensuring their children attend school, for example, with not only carrots but actually some pretty significant sticks if the children don't show up. What do you make of that as an approach to deal with the problem as so far identified?
I'm very, very worried about the sort of punitive approach. I mean, it comes in too late. I mean, parents who've been subject to parenting orders do say they have been effective, and they often say, I wish I'd had that support earlier on. Well, the answer is to give them the support earlier on, not wait until it becomes a crisis. And there's also evidence that with some of them it doesn't actually work. I mean, they do slide back. Some of the early truancy cases, the children are still playing truant now. I think it's much too complicated to be dealt with in a punitive way. And I think talking about rights, I mean, there's an awful lot of responsibility is put on parents without many rights in return. I refer back to the right to having a good teacher, the right to be taught in an orderly classroom, the right to have a consistency on behaviour. I think parents have rights to expect schools to deliver that in return. And I think if parents had the rights, they might feel a bit better about some of the punishments and the demonisation.
Gary Phillips, as a head teacher, do you think the government is putting too much pressure, as Fiona says, on parents, or do you rather welcome it?
It's the pressure-support paradox. The more pressure you put on, the less support, and vice versa. And telling people they're bad at something is never really going to help, is it?
And do you think the government is tending towards the punitive?
I think it's tending towards the punitive in press releases, but the reality of policy has been a great deal of financial support for schools such as mine, which have introduced four parents'
This is
officers.
an astonishing allegation that the government is interested in press releases to have an impact, Chris Gittings. Are you involved in a process as lead advisor of being punitive in the way that Fiona Miller is very clearly saying and Gary is also to a degree endorsing?
I'd like it clear. I'm an advisor. I mean, the government doesn't always listen to advice on those issues, but those matters. I mean, there has to be a balance in these matters. The whole business we're engaged in here is about relationships for behaviour and about relationships wherever it lies between parents and schools or wherever. When that relationship breaks down and it's exhibited by the child's education being damaged, something has to be done about it. And some of the things that work are punitive. But actually, in the whole field of behaviour, the things that work best are reward. The thing that I find most concerning is that when you get into these situations where there's a breakdown of that degree, if you actually look at it in terms of what's happened with the relationship with the family, the school is constantly referring problems to the family. He's done this today, he's done that today, he's done the other today. When do they ever get the reward that comes with the responsibility that they're taking? Where do they ever get the issues of this worked really well today? It was a bit of an exception, but it did work really well today.
I don't know whether it's hype or not, Tony Halpin. You read in the papers a lot of that last point that was being made, and the government is responding to more violent versions of that. Is it your view that the government is appropriately at least confronting that sort of... I mean, it's more than telling off sometimes, isn't it, that parents do to head teachers?
I'm not sure they are, actually. I think I agree with Fiona that a lot of this regulation is attempting to fill a vacuum that previously would have been filled by adult pressure. There's been a collapse of confidence in how to deal with other people's children. And as a result, we sort of fall back on rules and regulations as to how those children should behave and as to how their parents should respond to the institution. Whereas previously, I think as a number of speakers have said, teachers could have relied on parents to take their side in disputes with children. Now they're likely to take the other side, their child's side, and that creates conflict immediately.
You're bursting to get in, Roger Gray.
I am, because I want the young lady's point to be made about why, and yours as well, about...
She made it very well.
No, sorry. The point I'm really going to say is that the media picture of youth, including, if you like, unfortunately, our film to that extent, shows them as almost always bad. And therefore, when parents and indeed teachers are going to approach the question of getting involved with youth, they would say, this is going to be trouble. They don't see the good kids who are actually basically trying to do good work, so their assumption is already negative rather than positive. So I think we do have serious responsibility in this, so the parents are scared too.
OK, we've touched on the parental responsibility aspect of this. What about teacher responsibility? What is the role of teachers today? We've just been almost picking it up. Is it simply to educate, I'm putting it as crudely as possible, or are we demanding, in effect, that they also become childminders? Gary Phillips, what are teachers today? A little bit of both, or have they got to be able to, because of the pressures of exams and the rest, to focus on teaching?
Well, it's what are teachers and what are schools are actually two very interesting questions. The role of teachers is to maximise learning and to raise achievement, but the role of the school, and that's a very important definition to make, is to look at these more holistic issues, to support children who come from social deprivation, to support children who've got family difficulties, to ensure...
But that, unless you've got fantastic additional support staff, doesn't quite a lot of that fall onto the teachers themselves, not necessarily equipped as counsellors or psychotherapists?
Well, some of it does fall onto teachers acting as tutors, and that's about how a school prioritises its expenditure and how it works in social partnership with other organisations. And some schools choose to prioritise that, other schools choose to prioritise other aspects.
I want to go to a deputy head teacher, Nahida Maharasingham. Nahida.
Your question is?
My question is very simple. Is the role of teachers in this?
Well, if we understand learning, we understand that it's, learning and emotions are intrinsically related, and therefore responding to children's emotional well-being is very, very important, and you can't teach without doing that. If you're not happy, you're not going to learn. And so therefore positive behaviour management strategies, because we've talked a lot about the negative, but actually, the vast majority of our children are doing the right thing in classrooms, and teachers, in my experience, I'm only speaking for that, are doing a very good job at developing children's sense of self so that they can achieve their maximum potential.
Yes, Phil Willis.
No, can I just follow on from that? Because one of the key issues here, and I think Gary would support this, is the issue of leadership within a school and consistency. And I think the worst thing happens as a teacher when you're waiting for a class to arrive and they come with their coats on and chewing the gum and all the rest of it from a class where that's been accepted. And yet the school, says those are rules which should be obeyed. And I think we've got to have strong leadership, and that's not tough leadership, it's strong leadership. And it's consistency throughout the school community so that children actually know what those rules are. And I don't think that's too much to ask in every one of our schools.
But we do hear a great deal from teachers' organisations one way or another. Perhaps Patrick Nash, I can come to you, not teacher, Chief Executive of the Teacher Support Network, that you are being asked to do effectively too much. You're driving through the curriculum, you've got a whole lot of exams and tests to pursue, and at the same time you're being asked to be, in addition, the counsellor, the person who is helping children through an emotionally challenging and difficult period. Sorry?
That's education.
Okay.
That's what it's about.
That makes it sound a solved problem.
No, it isn't a solved problem, with the greatest of respect.
You don't have to have it, don't worry.
No, I know, no. But actually trying to compartmentalise or to actually teach children in silos just does not work. Many of our children are arriving in primary schools with a language of 60 words. They actually are talked to in the home in monosyllabic terms. They are shouted at. They are put in front of televisions, and suddenly a school has got to turn them, into a silk purse. You can't do that.
Patrick Nash.
I think I would agree in many ways that discipline and behaviour has been a problem for a long time, but certainly we're seeing more and more teachers facing up to that problem, actually taking charge of it in their own lives and also working with the staff, the heads and others in their schools. And I think that's the way forward. And we get some 3,000 teachers a year come to our counselling service for teachers, specifically not because they're a failure, because they want to learn how to manage their classrooms better, how to teach in a way that engages more people and helps them learn about a lot of things that, frankly, I don't think they have been taught about in their teacher training. I think there needs to be more emphasis on that.
Okay, I move on now from parents and teachers and see what other aspects there may be here, other factors need to be taken into account. We hear a lot about role models and the impact of role models. Roger, how important is this?
I think role models are incredibly important, but there's a very interesting problem. And when you've got split families and the father is not interested, not around, then for young boys at least, a crucial part of their development is missing. It puts a huge pressure on the mother, who may also be working, and she is in a way punished for the fact that the father isn't around.
If you take some famous footballer who behaves absolutely lousily and is treated as a hero and earns £10 million a day, is that having an impact on the way in which children regard their futures and their lives?
Not only that, not only is the money corrosive, but also the nice notion of an instant pop star. They don't see that if you work today, it'll take you months, years, and at the end of that you will get something modest but satisfying. Instead, they think there'll be an instant satisfaction. winning the pools is a kind of metaphor, if you like, but it is actually, I think, undermining the whole notion of what school is about.
Gillian Gordon, you work in a group, a team, which has developed the use of television, teaching kids, sometimes with problems, behind and in front of the screen. I'm not suggesting that you're encouraging them to become superstars overnight, as it were, but what's the role of that in combating what we're just talking about?
Well, YCTV, which is Youth Culture Television, is an organization that works with young people and engages with them and uses television as a means of engaging, a language that young people can understand. And in essence, we kind of create a program, which is, if you will, just to be a bit precious, is a sort of embedded curriculum, so that writing a screenplay is having to write. Doing a budget is numeracy, organizational skills, leadership skills, IT is editing. And we also do animation and graphics and that sort of thing.
That's very interesting. On the IT front, Alan Gotch, does this technological revolution have an impact on the ability of a young person to say, yeah, this classroom works?
I think IT has made a tremendous improvement to the classroom experience of many children since the government started to invest so heavily in it. I think the point the lady was making there with the work of the YCT is very important for how we look at curriculum in school, the curriculum and assessment as a whole. And I think there's an urgent need to make it more motivating and more engaging with children, and to go even further than we have with IT, but generally to look at the curriculum and decide, is that one of the roots of the problems? The problem is complex and multi-layered, but that's got to be one of the causes, in our opinion.
We read a lot about the extent to which we have to renegotiate relationships between younger and older people, whether they're pupils or parents or teachers. And we're encouraged to believe that children, young people, have a range of very difficult emotional problems to cope with. Are they, first of all, different from how they were? And secondly, are they a component in trying to understand how to improve the school environment?
What, emotional intelligence?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so, but I think that's quite a scary area for quite a lot of teachers and heads to get into. I mean, what does it mean? Is it properly defined? It could be very time-consuming. Is it an investment that will pay off? But I mean, I think Gary's school benefits from the learning mentors and some of the extra funding that London schools have to have adults who aren't teachers working in the school and aren't in a classroom all the time, who can form other relationships with pupils and with parents and families, and that makes a big difference.
John Bailey, you're a behaviour consultant.
Do you know, I think we've touched all the bases on this, relationships with parents, having clear behaviour plans, and of course you'd expect me to say proper and effective training for teachers and parents. But curriculum is the ghost at the feast, and if this might help with carrying the conversation forward. I spend hundreds of hours in classrooms, and I don't just observe and team teach. I spend a lot of time taking naughty little boys out of the room, and they often are boys, and they're usually year 8 or year 9, because that's where the behaviour peaks. And once their language has calmed down, I always try and take the worksheet or the book that's being used out of the room with me, and I say, could you just read to me what you're doing? And they start barking at the print. They finger one word after another. And that brings in the whole question of whether we're teaching a curriculum that's suited to these children, or whether they have the tools to behave. Because if I couldn't understand what was happening in the classroom, I'd start a fight too.
There are some other things I want to come back to about teachers' training, but let's pick up straight away on the curriculum, because our poll showed that some 25% of teachers blame an inadequate, unimaginative curriculum. Alan Gotch from the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, what do you make of it? Alan Gotch?
Certainly, that's what we feel. There's plenty of evidence to support this. Mike Tomlinson, in the build-up to his report, mentioned the need to look at curriculum and make it more engaging and motivating for children. There's no big secret about this. Some schools are already doing it. The RSA project is a notable example. They've had tremendous success with that, not just on the basis of learning, but also reducing problems with behaviour. We'd like to see that extended and more drive and resources given to that kind of thinking.
Chris, do you accept that, or do you regard the curriculum, as we've heard very powerfully here, as a key part of the problem?
Absolutely. When I first started teaching, I still remember the first time I had to teach bulbs and corms as a biology teacher. And I found myself saying to the class, you've got to learn it because it's in the curriculum. You're going to be tested on it. There's an outcome from that point of view. The reality is that the curriculum has got more flexible, and the input from the strategies and developments about the form of the curriculum ought to allow people the degree of flexibility to teach in ways that are really engaging for children. The problem is that the perception that there is of that is it is driven by rubric and expectation and standardization. And I think that's the kiss of death to teaching, frankly. I mean, I think what we have to do is to interpret the curriculum as individual teachers in ways that bring it to life to the children.
Gary, it can't be... it's easy to blame a curriculum, and I'm sure it's not your case, but is it possible there are some sort of not very good teachers, rather lazy teachers, and say, well, if only I had a decent, easier time, I knew I'd get the tuts, then I wouldn't have a problem. Let's blame the curriculum. Or do you blame the curriculum?
Can I tut as well?
Yeah, of course you can.
I think Chris makes an important point, that the perception of what we can do with the curriculum now and the reality are actually quite different. There is a need to make the curriculum far more engaging for many young people who are disengaged. You've got young people listening to iPod broadcasts, which they download, then they go into classroom and it's chalk and talk and worksheets. And when you look at the video, the programme that Roger put together, what you actually saw was the response to pretty poor curriculum. Here's some worksheets which I want you to finish.
So you have a curriculum which is unfitted for today's needs. You say that, other teachers say that, senior advisors say that, Fiona says that, practically everyone in here. Does anyone here not say that? Right, and it's across the spectrum here. How long does it get, do you believe, to get from where you are with a curriculum that is doing harm rather than good to a curriculum that's doing good rather than harm?
Well, we're on our way, I think. We're promised a slim down of Key Stage 3 in terms of the curriculum in secondary schools. We've got the beginning of a 14 to 19 framework, both of which should start to give greater flexibility. The huge amount of IT in schools is freeing up people's minds as to how they deliver the curriculum. I was in some lessons today when children were preparing for an English assignment using video cameras and electronic whiteboards. 3-4 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. You know, quite frankly, just the price crash has brought that about more than anything else.
Now, I just want to make myself a little bit more unpopular before we go on by raising what may be thought an uncomfortable question for teachers, which I touched on then. Are they actually good enough? I pointed out, not surprisingly, only 17% of teachers actually cited poor teaching techniques as a factor contributing to discipline problems in schools. So is this an accurate reflection? Do a vast majority have very good teaching techniques, or is there a problem about the way teachers teach? Is there good teaching and bad teaching that makes a difference? Fiona?
Definitely. I mean, I think most teachers are good, and all the evidence suggests that. But I mean, there will be some poor teachers, and there will be some teachers who can't control their class.
Chris, are the teachers, given that they have a curriculum to be a teacher, it's a very demanding job, do they, in their training, have enough advance work, if it's worth it, in how to cope with the complexity of problems that we're talking about that young people have, from poor behaviour to violent behaviour, across the spectrum to emotional needs that may be quite difficult unless you're trained to detect early?
In a word, no, they don't have enough of that, by any means. As I said earlier on, the single biggest demand for support and help and assistance and training from teachers is about behaviour improvement and behaviour management. I would put alongside that attendance, incidentally, because we need to deal with behaviour and attendance in the same way, operating that way. You're quite right. I've been around the country equally. I've seen some stunning work going on in terms of relationship building, in terms of behaviour improvement in schools, from some very, very dedicated people. It's interesting, however, that sometimes the people that are best at that kind of work go unrecognised equally. I've seen some real unsung heroes, and not just teachers, incidentally, either, support staff doing stunning work with children who other people find very difficult to manage with. So absolutely there needs to be more support and training, and that is becoming increasingly available through the national strategies, through the work we're doing in leadership development. Stunning as it may seem, until 2002 there was no requirement in getting qualified teacher status that you knew anything specifically about behaviour management in schools. That's changed, and it's now available with initial teacher training. Uptake, difficult to say yet. But,
Graham Hallett, where's Graham Hallett? Graham, you are a teacher trainer at St Martin's College, yeah, in Lancaster, and you actually do more initial teacher training anywhere else. How big a component of what you're seeking to do involves what we've just been talking about, the problem?
Well, there are two answers to the question. Firstly, we have a dedicated special subject in special needs now as part of our undergraduate training on our 4-year programme. Without going down the route of wanting to get into a theoretical perspective too soon, because there is a real danger, in our opinion, that if you get into causation of behavioural difficulties, student teachers have a tendency to hang all remedies on that, rather than becoming critical, reflective, effective practitioners, which is what we would want them to do as part of our training.
Can I ask very briefly, Gary, can I ask you, would it be helpful to you if teachers, new teachers, came into the school with rather more training in this area of pupil behaviour, pupil difficulty?
I think there's a delicate balance, because too much training on behaviour can scare some.
They think they're going to go into a hellhole or something.
Yes, it can scare them. I think it's more about induction for new teachers once they've got their once they've finished their teacher training, and what you do with them before you let them start teaching your own school. And we tend to have a 1 to 2 month programme to induct them before they start teaching full-time in our school.
OK. We have been exploring so far the whys, the wherefores and more. But the fact is, of course, that there always have been, and they're probably always going to be, badly behaved children. We've heard quite a lot of views so far and discussed a range of theories and thoughts about the causes. I want to look now towards, we've already touched on, I want to look more carefully now at some of the solutions. Our poll tells us that 72% of the teachers support a zero-tolerance approach to tackling discipline. 51% of all teachers believe that heads should be given more powers to exclude disruptive kids from school, and that rises to 63% among head teachers themselves. 10% of teachers still support corporal punishment. Gary Phillips, 72%, zero tolerance. Do you have zero tolerance?
Do I personally have zero tolerance?
In your school? I'm sure you don't have zero tolerance.
I think I'd like to come back. We do have a policy on some of the lower level disruptive behaviour of zero tolerance, because that's how there's clear leadership and guidance for everybody as to what to do. You must do certain things when entering a class. You mustn't do certain things around the building.
Be specific. It's
chewing gum, taking off coats, settling down carefully, settling when the teacher raises their hand and things like that. And that gives everybody a structure to work in, which is what children and teachers like. What we're then very lucky to have are the pastoral staff, or the learning mentors, as many people here will know them, who support that. So if children move through the sanction system, there are clear consequences. Detention, exclusion points, a day with me, which they will get if they don't follow those very clear and simple rules. So it's about, tough on the causes of bad behaviour as well as punishing it.
Surely. If you're trying to tackle the causes, nonetheless you get the bad behaviour and you get to the level of exclusion. Looking at it from your long perspective, Phil Willis, do you feel at all there is a temptation, if not a realisation, to solve the problem quick? Get rid of the kid.
Oh, I think there is. I think there is, and I don't blame teachers for that, and I don't blame heads for that. I think we're now in sort of a culture where we want instant results. And I think the whole panel, in fact, most of this discussion, is really about that the solution to poor behaviour is about consistency. It's also about positive behaviour. It's about actually rewarding good behaviour so that they become the norms. And in fact, children, a head teacher said to me when I started teaching, he said, Phil, remember two things. First of all, no children ever wants to be disliked. And secondly, no child rises to low expectations. And I think if every teacher and every head could drum that into their own psyche, we'd do okay.
Arthur Jarman, NUT, are there your members who reach too quickly for the sin bin, the exclusion?
No, I don't think so. I think most teachers expect behaviour from the children they teach, which will enable them to teach properly. We'd like to see a sort of charter of rights and responsibilities, so that children have certain entitlements and certain rights, and teachers have rights and responsibilities, and so do governors and so on. We think there should be an exchange then within the school of these rights and responsibilities, so that schools are fun places to be, not prison camps, but places where there are agreed behaviour policies with support for both children and teachers which work.
Chris Giddens, it's obviously desirable to have the least people possible being excluded. Are there things, we heard Gary talking there about his sort of tier, if you like, of punishment. Is there a way that you can get up to that level where you are tempted to exclude, but you don't have to exclude, that could be done more, that we could have more of?
Absolutely. There's, again, some very good examples of schools working in partnerships now in order that not just that they're sharing the problem of children who are very hard to place in those settings, but also because they're sharing what you do in relationship to avoiding exclusion and how you tackle that particular issue. Learning support units, there are now 1,100 around the country, primary and secondary, in growing numbers. A wonderful way of actually working with children so that you don't need to reach the point of exclusion. If the child's at a point where they're not managing in the classroom for all the reasons we're describing, their literacy skills may be low or whatever it may be, you give them some intensive work and support so actually you can give them that kind of impetus so they can get back into the classroom and manage with the situation that we're all finding ourselves in.
Of course, Roger, pupils who don't like the school, bored by the curriculum, have behavioural problems of one kind or another, perhaps what they're actually longing for is for Gary to say, sorry,
absolutely,
your time's up, you're out.
It's absolutely true. Being excluded for kids who don't want to be in school is, of course, a ticket to ride. The real point, I think, was made by this gentleman there, that kids want to be liked. And the people that matter most to them over the age of 13 are other kids. And if you can harness the goodwill of other kids, you will find a wonderful resource there that in a school like Acton Burley, where they have anti-bullying programs done by the kids themselves, and in another school, Highcliffe School in Plymouth, where 8-year-olds took over the vandalism problem and solved it, and used to call the parents in and saying, what are you doing about your kid? You will find the real secret resource in the school are the kids themselves.
Because other work that you've done in your role as filmmaker in the past have shown that if kids are on the streets or excluded, they go from a problem to something worse.
All kids want attention, and if they don't get attention for doing well, they'll get attention for doing badly. Why do we have to wait until they've done such bad things that suddenly all the best brains in the city are lined up in court to figure out how to punish them instead of how to engage them?
I'm going to go straight to the centre here. I should know your name. What's your name?
Ramiz.
Yeah, go on.
Our school council, we found there was like a small behaviour problem and we wanted to cut it down. So we designed, it's in our beginning stages, we started something called the Behaviour Panel, which is student-led. Yeah. And basically what this is like a mini court where students interview the students who have done a bad thing and decide the punishment from there on. Loads of people in the school want to learn, and they don't want bad behaviour to stop their education.
And who had the idea? Did the head have the idea, or did the head talking to senior boys and girls have the idea?
This is the school council's idea. That's the idea, to get every student's point across. So then the school council, which is all student-led again, decided that they want to cut down this behaviour. So.
Clearly, people don't want exclusion. But let me go to Peggy Gosling from Tower Hamlets, because you're here, Peggy. It's easy to say, isn't it, that exclusion is not the answer. Tower Hamlets, like many other inner city areas, has problems where you do actually oversee exclusion. Do you think that the balance at the moment is right, or are we excluding? Are you excluding? Schools excluding too many?
I think any pupil that's excluded is too many. And I think Tower Hamlets, as an authority, take the same view, that we don't see exclusion as a solution for any pupils. We try and deal with the issue by providing alternative placements for children on a temporary basis.
So if a head says, I got a real problem with this kid, it's disrupting the classes, I want him out, her out. Do you say sorry, or do you actually, as it were, get black marks as a head if you do that? How do you stop it?
No, not black marks as a head, but what we would be saying to that head teacher is, look, what support has been put in for this pupil? How can we help you as a local authority in terms of, what's needed for this pupil? And I would be very surprised if a head came to me, and I've never heard of that pupil before, and saying we've got to exclude. I think what I would want to see be the case is that we are knowing about children who are causing concern.
So do you actually believe, because this is quite exceptional, do you believe that there is no need at all to exclude kids from school, and that this process that is now absolutely part and parcel of the system is absolutely redundant and damaging?
I think it's damaging for certain, and I think exclusion is not a solution for anyone.
Gary?
Exclusion is a punishment. It is not a solution whatsoever.
Right.
I'd agree. One of the things we've done with a number of neighbouring schools is we've clubbed together and we have a library tutor who works in the library near to school. So any child who's been excluded goes there.
Gillian Gordon, you have kids coming to you who've been excluded, don't you?
Yes, we have.
Do you think you're picking up pieces that shouldn't have been kicked out, or what?
Well, I think we're kind of a bridge in a way. And we can actually, I think, and we all, I think, agree that creativity creates a space for learning. And that's something that we can do. I know that Siobhan was going to make a point too about exclusion, who's one of our members.
I got excluded from school, and I found that going to a pupil referral unit was better for me, and I learnt more and got better grades than I would have been in normal school.
Do you think, you don't have to give the details,
No.
it's free set. Do you think you were rightly excluded from the perspective of the school or not, or do you think you weren't given enough of a chance?
Partly yes and partly no, because...
And if you when you were first excluded, you didn't go immediately into CCTV, did you?
No,
What were you doing once you were excluded?
nothing. And then I got put into a unit, and then one of the workers from YCTV came to my unit, and that's how I got into it. But it was like, the grades I came out with was better than most of the people that still go to my school came out with. So it's like,
sorry, go on.
You had more attention paid to you in the small group,
it's
right?
like it was more relaxed. It wasn't as... The tension wasn't as much, because when you go in, when you're in mainstream school, if you walk in a class with your jacket on, you're sent out. Yeah, the tension. The way I see it, a child wearing a jacket, that's not disrupting their learning. They can still read their book, they can still write down. And they're wearing a jacket, but they're still able to learn.
I wanted to bring in our teachers at the back there, because you were listening intently. Either of you, whoever wants to come in.
I disagree. I do understand your point of view, but it's all about consistency. And I think with regard to the red jacket, if you come in, I mean, you're wearing that jacket there, that's a fashion thing. A lot of other students in your class might not be in the same position to be able to wear jackets. And I think consistency in school is there so that we don't get bullying, because children will get picked on by their peers.
Lots of people want in. Tony, I'll bring you in next. Down here at the front.
I think a lot of the concern about the way this question is addressed, it's all being talked about in terms of help and support offered to children who are problems. And other children who are not problems in the classroom see this, and they draw the lesson from that you get more attention, more opportunities to go and work in TV if you misbehave than if you knuckle down and do your work. And that has to be a wrong message to send.
And that's why you have to have this tier that leads up to, are you implying, leads up to exclusion, that you know that's going to be the end game?
I think there has to be a very clear element that you're being punished, at least in part, for your behaviour, and that you should take responsibility for that. And if you take responsibility, from that will flow some good things. But simply to treat it as a child needing help, that only addresses half the question, I think.
We go to the woman, the school pupil, young woman. You got your hand up.
What I was going to say is everyone focuses on the discipline of the young children, but we haven't actually touched on rewards, and I think that is very important, because if you focus on the discipline, everyone wants attention, so they'll go and do something bad to get that attention. But if you said, all right, then you'll get in trouble if you do this, that, and that, but then on the other hand, if you do well and you do this, you achieve that, then you'll get this in reward. But they don't actually do that. Well, my school personally does, but I've heard of other schools that don't do that. They just focus on the discipline, and I think that's quite...
Okay, I've got to move on to our last little bit. You may have seen the television series that tries to transform the behaviour of a group of so-called unteachable pupils through new and innovative teaching techniques. Wayne Simon, what did you make of this approach, or your approach? I know it's not exactly the same as that, but they did apparently achieve astonishing results. The most difficult, unruly kids suddenly started organising their own lives, running the thing together, positively engaged, using peer pressure to the right result.
Our technique called self-esteem through sport is perhaps, in my view, one of the most successful techniques used to engage young men especially, using sport as a vehicle. And the 4 A's that we look at and what we aim for is attachment. You empower the young people to feel a part of something, i.e. the school. They feel part of the school, therefore their behaviour is changed because they've got a vested interest in being there. Attachment, achievement, whatever sport or anything that we're involved in, they achieve something from it and they get awards for it. It's not just given away willy-nilly. They have to actually achieve, so they get award. And the young lady that said reward, which is almost the same as award. And finally, the fourth A is attitude. Because they're attached, they achieve, they get an award, their attitude changes.
Sheila Gunn, when the conversation was going on a bit earlier about the need to be quite tough, do you, from your perspective, is there a sort of tender, tough solution here, or is there still too much tenderness and not enough toughness?
I'm not sure if the balance is quite right, because I get a lot of parents complaining to me that their children are behaving well, and they're being penalised because their class is disrupted just by a few other people, and that these other pupils who are behaving badly are the ones getting all the attention. And they feel this is unfair because their children are behaving really rather well, and they're losing out because it's very difficult to learn properly in a class in which you've just got one or two, sometimes there's only one child who's just mucking around. So I'm not sure if the balance is quite right.
Just want to, I'm afraid, bring this to a pause and just go round the panel for its quick final collective thought. Chris first.
Well, firstly, I mean, I think when you sit and listen to the sort of comments we've been getting from the young people here, you feel somewhat humbled. And they're not theories, they're just sheer common sense practice. There's a lot of common ground in behaviour improvement, a lot of common good practice, lots of good stuff happening. It needs to be better shared. We need to understand better how it works, that some people manage situations in classrooms better than others.
Fiona Miller.
I would say work with parents as partners, don't punish them. Focus on consistency in school leadership, absolutely crucial, and good teaching. And don't forget about the curriculum, because the secondary school curriculum is quite boring. It's driven by too many tests and too many exams, and it sets a lot of children up to fail, which is why they start to misbehave. And I think that's absolutely, if the government wanted to make a really radical reform rather than fake radical reforms, they would do something about the secondary school curriculum.
Roger Grave?
I don't think you can punish children into learning or even into behaving well. I think you have to give them some reason for behaving well. And I would just suggest that you ask yourself 3 questions. What are the conditions that foster learning? To what extent are they present in my classroom? And if they're not, what can I do about it?
Carrie Phillips?
I'd obviously like to echo what the others have said. Children who exhibit poor behaviour have a special educational need, and it makes me very angry to hear people begrudge them the extra support and guidance that those young people need, because if they get it in school, they'll make far better citizens than if they don't.
On that note, a pause, at least in this debate. Thank you, members of the panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming here and contributing towards the debate. And I hope that it's been constructive and useful as we await to see what the government decides it wants to do to deal with this issue. For now, from me, from everyone here, good night.